A lot of people live their lives in the faith that there is no Santa Claus. Well, I've got news for you. I have to tell a wonderful story about the telescope, which relates to what we've been talking about. The telescope seems to be a good metaphor for psychedelics. When Galileo discovered the telescope, he was not immediately slapped down by the church. It took a few months for them to even sort out what the issue was here. And then, of course, eventually he had to recant. But in the year preceding his trial, Galileo was, of course, before the invention of the telescope, well known in influential circles in Rome as an inventor and scientist, natural scientist. So in his apartment on the rooftop, he set up his telescope and would hold small garden parties for influential Roman citizens, among them great cardinals and princes of the church who were involved in deciding the issue of whether or not he was dabbling in heretical material. So one evening he had Cardinal Roncalli of the Holy Office, which is the keepers of the doctrine of the faith, and had him to dinner and said, "Excellency, would you care to look through my telescope?" And the cardinal allowed as how he would like to look through the telescope, and so Galileo pointed it at the full moon, which was rising over the city, and the cardinal peered into the telescope, and Galileo said, "And so, Excellency, as you see, there appear to be oceans and range of mountains on our sister world." And the cardinal looked for a long time and said, "Yes, but Signor, surely we can agree among ourselves that this is only a hallucination." Well, it turns out they couldn't agree among themselves that it was a hallucination, and I don't think that we can agree with our establishment that what we perceive is only a hallucination. It is, and yet it isn't. It is a true hallucination.
One thing.
Go ahead.
So here's a repeated question, and it has to do with drugs, psychedelics. I know that you didn't necessarily recommend it, but you also didn't sound like you were against it. And the word has been coming up a few times.
Maybe I've overdone this even-handedness trip.
My question is, what is there to know about drugs and brain damage? They have advertisements with a pen and an egg going in there and it's frying your brain. Every you do it, you knock some brain cells out. And
well, the president's consort urges us to simply say no, and I can't remember who it was. I think it was Tim Leary the other night was wearing a T-shirt which said "Just Say No," K-N-O-W. See how close to the surface it is and how nearly the same thing? So that's the short and obvious answer. What is there to know about drugs? A huge amount. I mean, this is a department of human knowledge called pharmacology that is the life study of many people. In terms of this question of psychedelics and being a spiritual adventurer and coming to a place in your life where you say, then you have to make very clear choices. My own approach to this has been to give great force to tradition. That's why we're here talking about shamanically utilized plants, because they are plants with a history of human usage, thousands of years old. We already know that they do not cause tumors or madness or miscarriages, because if that were the case, they would have been pushed aside over millennia of usage. A private prejudice of my own that I urge on people is that the drugs they take should be as much like brain chemistry as possible, as non-invasive of the physical brain as possible. Fortunately and suggestively, the strongest of all hallucinogens are the ones most like ordinary brain chemistry. Another thing I think that's important is to be sort of pharmacologically monomaniacal. It's good to do, when you find out what works for you, just really do it into the ground, rather than being someone who is always, this week it's 2CB and next week it's something else and then something else. It's much better, I think, if you find an ally who resonates with you to then utilize that. Eventually, you see, when we move beyond the current sort of dark age that we're living in, the idea that governments can tell you what drugs you can take will be as bizarre a notion as that governments can buy and sell human beings, or that there should be recognized a divine right of kings. It's actually a civil rights issue. And, in the 19th century, people's argument against women's suffrage was that it would be unimaginable, that the world would be destroyed if you gave women the vote, that just madness would ensue. This is now the argument against allowing people to make these decisions about their bodies and their spiritual development. And yet science, which just relentlessly rolls forward, creating an endless cornucopia of steroids, hallucinogens, aphrodisiacs, memory enhancers, so forth and so on, is presenting us over and over again with this dilemma of how do we chemically manage ourselves in the kind of world we're living in. And I tried to indicate this morning, I think this is central to understanding what human beings are, that there is no such thing as a person without habitual relationships to plants. And it's tea, coffee, sugar, alcohol, and then a wider spectrum. But yes, cereals. We embed ourselves, the very way in which we define good feeling and expression of the self is these various states of mind that we associate with our diet and our habit. People get up, the first thing in the morning most people do is choose the first drug of the day. Will it be tea? Will it be coffee? And so forth and so on. There's nothing wrong with this. We apparently, by our ability to collect, and it actually, it all goes back to our omnivorous diet. Most animals are not omnivores. Most animals have a food source, a spectrum of foods that they eat that is very narrow. But if you're an omnivore, if your habit is to eat everything and to test everything in the environment for protein, then you lay yourself open to exposure to vast numbers of mutagens, hallucinogens, tumor-inducing compounds, steroids, galactosides, poisons, all kinds of things. You accept that these things are impinging and selecting on the human genome. And very quickly, we have evolved into this very quirky kind of species that, as I said this morning, addicts to everything. I mean, it is the source of our great anguish and our great grandeur. We can addict to a piece of land and call it the homeland and defend it against all comers and slaughter with impunity anybody who gets near it and claim it after we've been away from it for 10,000 years as ours because we once were there. We can addict to another person. You know, anyone who's experienced heartbreak, real heartbreak, knows, you know, this is like a withdrawal syndrome. I mean, bursting into tears every 20 minutes and not sleeping and vomiting every 3 hours. I mean, this person has a severe dependency which is being broken. In the same way, we ideologically enslave ourselves. So there is no percentage in denying this side of ourselves. What we have to do is manage it. Manage it in some way that serves obviously community-preserving purposes. And I think that the model is always tradition, that the traditional compounds, the traditional plants of shamanic usage are the ones that we are probably meant to use. They fit our hand the way a tool fits our hand. They were made for us. We co-evolved with these things. I was talking to Lester Grinspoon about this recently, and he said the way you can tell how long human beings have been using a drug is by how few side effects that drug has. Because, of course, there is this mutual leveling of the stress of contact. Symbiosis has never been taken seriously by evolutionary biologists. Food as a mutagenic influence has never been taken seriously by human evolutionary theorists. And yet, obviously, that is what has driven us to such a rapid state of evolution, our willingness to expose ourselves to an extremely complex and shifting environment that was, in fact, the things we put into our bodies. Everything else stayed pretty much the same over long periods of time. So the question which the gentleman asked goes to the whole heart of the matter, to the fact that, you know, we are living now in a kind of hysteria about drugs. Tim Leary said LSD was a compound capable of causing psychotic behavior in people who hadn't taken it. This can now be generalized. We see an entire society in a drug-induced frenzy, induced by drugs that they have never taken, you see.
In hypothesizing about the early dawn of consciousness of mankind, if it were assisted by visionary plants, would this have made a genetic change in the DNA strand rather than just an experience for that hominoid or whoever it was that was enlightened? Could it have made a mutation and then this consciousness was then passed on to their offspring?
Well, it's a very complicated situation, and where we don't have all the information. But what it looks like happened was there were arboreal canopy living primates in Africa, in a tropical forest similar to the Amazon in extent. And over a long period of time, 100,000 years or so, drying set in, and grasslands emerged, and the forest retreated, and these primates who already had binocular vision and an advanced grasping hand and a social form of existence with group signaling, were forced down onto the veldt. And there, in a much more restricted environment in terms of numbers of species of plants, they abandoned their previous vegetarian, fruitarian habits and became omnivores, began testing all the food sources in the environment. Co-evolving in this grassland situation were herds of ungulate animals, bison and zebra and this kind of thing. In the manure of these animals was psilocybin-containing mushrooms. Well, you see, the psychedelic, to be the trigger for the emergence of human consciousness, it must be African, it must require no preparation, it must stand out from its environment, and it must confer an adaptive advantage. Now, it seems to me the only plant or organism which fulfills all these points is the mushroom. What the mushrooms do in low doses is confer slightly increased visual acuity. Well, you only have to have taken evolution 1A to know that if you have two populations and one of them has something in their food that increases visual acuity, and these are pack-hunting animals, that the ones with this vision-enhancing compound in their diet will have a more successful reproductive strategy than the competitors, and it will dominate. Well, at a slightly higher dose, psilocybin, like all CNS stimulators, can be interpreted as an aphrodisiac. In other words, prolonged erection, prolonged interest in sex, so forth and so on. At a slightly higher level, it flowers out into a visionary experience. So it's like a stair-step process where the deeper the organism imbibes this one item in the food chain, the more payback there seems to be. First better hunting, then better sex, then great ideas. Who could turn it down? And I've talked, like, you know, when Rian Eisler and I appeared here, Rian is by no stretch of the imagination a psychedelico. I mean, she's a very straight and very wise lady, but not a stoner. But she said, you're right. There is something going on having to do with pastoralism, having to do with this point in time where the previous pack-hunting primates, instead of killing their prey, began to pen them and began to relate to them, to addict to them, is what it was. And I was saying to someone earlier today, here's a test of how conscious of the real world you are. What is the weirdest thing about a cow? And my victim said, the eyes. And I said, no, the weirdest thing about a cow is its tits, obviously. I mean, have you ever seen tits like that anywhere else? These tits are made to fit a human hand. It's obvious. And so this is an example of very old coevolution, co-adaptation. The human being, the cow, and then less immediately obvious, but nevertheless powerfully present, is the mushroom. Joan referred to this morning. You see, I think what happened is women outsmarted themselves. The men were off silently hunting and practicing being quiet as they stalked their prey. The women were creating language in order to describe the taxonomy of these various food plants, of which they probably could distinguish 400 or 500 plants, seasons, soil conditions, variants, unusual conditions of all sorts, which parts of the plant were edible, which were poisonous, so forth and so on. And as always happens when you succeed in an enterprise where you seek control, you inevitably simplify. So the women became so conversant with the power of plants that they realized they need no longer gather them. They could grow them. And then they realized they wouldn't, of course, grow all the plants they knew about. They would only grow those plants that grew easily, produced large fruit, and had a big payback. And suddenly, the women undercut their own power base, and it became possible to silently practice very dulling agriculture. And the gods then became not the gods of the orgy and the hunt and the wild plants, but the gods became corn gods and wheat gods. And it became important to be able to get up early in the morning and walk off to your field and weed, and less important to be able to ecstatically prophesy and have visions. Well, that's just one scenario, but it's worth talking about, I think, because how we image our emergence out of animal organization is going to color very deeply how we image our transition into a transcendental realm. That's why I talk about what I call the archaic revival rather than the new age. All this talk about shamanism is a reaching back 15, 25,000 years to those models to steady us. We should go out the way we came in, which means as a partnership society, as a psychedelic society, as a tribal society. And so by thinking about the origins, we actually gain an intimation of the future. Yes?
The persecution of witches is what's going on anyway, for the very things you're just describing for women.
Oh yeah, I mean, it is all of a piece. The suppression of women, it's a complicated thing. I mean, it has to do with solar calendars, which gained prominence with the invention of agriculture. See, I think the invention of agriculture was where it began to go wrong. Well, some people say it was the domestication of the horse or cities or this and that, but people idealize the the Neolithic and think that this was fine. But I think already in place were notions of hanging on to the land, of storing wealth, of cooperating, coerced cooperation in the production of food, a simplified vocabulary about nature. All of these things were put in place by the Neolithic. But, you know, Arthur Young, some of you may know his theories, he has this idea that every state of freedom is accomplished by a descent into a state of bondage. So that, for instance, molecular chemistry is the product of the molecular bond. If you have chemical systems with so much energy that there can be no molecular bonding, then all you have is atomic chemistry. You have not the possibility of organic chemistry. So the coming and going of the male ego, the coming and going of the repression of women and the feminine seems to be related to how much exposure there is to these wild plant states. Because that, you see, women come up against it because they bury the dead, they birth the living, they know that all is not as it appears to be. They are informed of the fact that culture is a charade. But men believe all this stuff.
Well, at least those women that were able to, like the witches, were the women who, and the few men who stayed.
Well, what there has to be is an uncorruptible source of psychedelic experience. And, you know,
in a sanctuary environment also.
Well, in some way it has to be uncorruptible, and the best way that I've found is to urge people to grow mushrooms, because the mushroom itself then acts as the purity maintainer, the quality control, You can see what it is. When you have LSD in front of you, you have a little piece of paper or a little piece of gelatin. Who knows what this is, you know? And some way to extract the drugs from the market economy. This was what undid the 1960s. Some people got high on LSD, and other people realized you could make a fortune on it. And once that realization hit home, it was all she wrote. So there has to be, some way of taking the opportunity to create a huge financial empire out of it. And how this is done, I'm not sure. But the simplest solution, I think, is grow your own and depend on nature. Nature is a bountiful storehouse. This is where these things come from, and
Grow or gather.
Grow or gather. Somebody over here. We haven't done much over here. This lady.
This question is for Terence. Can you speak a bit about your experience in some of the older societies you've lived in, and the relationship between visual artists, artisans, object makers, and shamanism?
Shall I repeat your question? The question was, could I speak about the relationship of artists to shamanism in some of the more, the pre-literate Amazon societies that I've been in? Well, I think, people have the notion about tribal people, that their life is very hard. In some environments and some situations it is, but people try everywhere to create leisure for themselves and to have an opportunity for aesthetic expression. In psychedelic societies, everything is art. I'm thinking particularly of, for instance, the Shipibo in their classic expression. The Shipibo are an Amazonian tribe. They cover every utilitarian object with design. Everything is an expression of the images of the internal world, and language and puns and this sort of thing become very important. Life, when you have nothing, life is easily transformed into art, because there's a howness about everything. How you make a fire, how you cast a pot, how you cook a monkey. Everything is a paradigmatic activity, meaning everything is traditional, everything has been done millions of times before in the way that your people do it. And so the individual is seen almost like just the cutting edge of the ancestral energy. And they even have the concept of what they call the way of the ancestors. And so you'll be doing something like sharpening a stick, and someone will come up to you and say, don't do it that way. We do it this way. This is the way of the ancestors. Then they show you how to do it, and sure enough, it is easier to do it that way. Probably because this is the morphogenetic field of the howness. And I think Ralph mentioned this morning the confluence of yoga, alchemy, and shamanism in the Taoist tradition. And I think it's worth stressing that, because to my mind, Taoism is the most refined ideal of human existence. It is open-ended. It always yields to a good laugh. It's not dogmatic. It's rooted in nature. It sees the world as shells of energy that can be manipulated and cultivated. And I really see Taoism as something broader than the nature religion that arose in southern China pre-Confucius and so forth. I see it as the kind of natural way of being in the world that tribally alive societies settle into. And it's what we're trying to recreate. Appropriate activity. That alone would create a world-informing revolution. When I say that we must change our minds, the physical accompaniment to changing our minds is that we will begin to behave appropriately, bury our shit, manage our resources, lower our voices. It's simply awareness, and awareness of awareness. And this is what these societies have that we have lost. And I think it's because the male ego is a wart on human perfection. And everybody has one. It's not a put down of men. The male ego is a part of the repertoire of every human personality in the modern world. But it is unnecessary, divisive, and out of Tao. And this reconnection with the Tao, with the flow, with the invisible, the spirits, the energies of sky and water and earth, the psychedelics impel us into recognizing these things, but it's our own intent that can allow us to bring these things back into the world and apply them. So for me, that was the lesson of so-called primitive people.
How do we step aside from the information that, all of us here obviously must think about this, is information coming through the television or the great theater. This fascism, it's so subtle because it's so sub-embedded, because it's entirely a censorship of economy. So you experience it just a pragmatic reality. You don't experience it as what it is, controlling and telling us how we are to perceive reality. And, we had the 60s, we had an inkling of the shamanic or the experiential, then that was pushed aside. So I think it's a test case to watch with this election. I'm sorry that you said when Bush is elected. I'd like to think that's an if. But when you talked about that unexploded bomb, well, let's see how the forces of disinformation can repress that unexploded bomb and allow Bush to get reelected, or how to learn to continue to look between the lines and not. I was close to historical events, learned to look between the lines, and yet I ingest daily stuff that I don't question because it seems low on the order of priority, whether I should look and see what is this really about. But we're given a 360 hologrammatic redefinition of our reality entirely through the media. And lazily, we consent and co-create by ingesting it. So that's the thing, to sidestep that and look for the nature ally.
But when you look at the cultural images that we've inherited, I think it's very easy to see that monotheism is a great deal of what lies at the root of our problem. Because, it was Jung who made the observation that as we picture our gods, so then do we model our psyches. That in fact our gods are models of our psyches. And monotheism, which is basically the idea that God is all-powerful, omnipresent, male, and not to be trifled with, if that's your model of the psyche, well then you're describing someone who's extremely pathological. That is a pathological model of the personality. And yet, how many generations of men have behaved as though they were Yahweh? And we buy into this unquestioningly.
Metaphor that you'd say that man's law would be stronger than the laws of nature that women experience stringently as the doors open and close of birth and death, and that man would impose himself on the doorway between nature through the woman's body to creation. That's the final metaphor.
Well, that's omnipotence.
Yes.
Omnipotence. We can interfere with anything. We can do anything. Back here somewhere.
Much or not close to all of what you say is really pearls to my ears, and I feel there's a resonance, especially when people have waited to hear something described in a certain way. It's like coming home. There's a real fine edge that I feel in myself when we get to a place of an us and them really strong. And I noticed that when this man brought up the thing about the politicians, you know, there was a certain uncomfortableness and a kind of laughter that very easily came forth. And I know that in my work with the nuclear waste issue, it's very easy to get in this almost victimized role. It's like someone else is doing it to us. And it seems to me, in part of almost strategizing together, if we really want this truth that you're, you know, describing to really be present on this planet and in our midst, that there's one aspect of, like, we have work to do ourselves. That's, to me, the strongest thing that you said. If you can really embody it impeccably and continue to look at your own homework, that you don't have to so much worry about what's going on around you. But there's another place where it seems to me we do have to worry or be concerned or care for what's going on around us. And in being impeccable on that level, it seems to me that some of the mind change has to do with this shift of us, them, and seeing them as the enemy and us as the victim. And I know that in the nuclear work, one of the strongest things we did was to take a group of people down to Westinghouse, down to where they're supposedly burying the waste in the ground, to see that the people that have taken on this job are actually, they really believe they're doing the right thing, and they really believe that they're doing it for us. And to almost, from that place of common ground, start trying to share this information. So I'm wondering, in terms, I guess I just really felt personal need to comment about that in face of this us-them place that we can get into, and to see if you have any comments about our impeccability in terms of dealing with this situation correctly.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I don't really think in terms of us and them. I really resist paranoia. I don't believe in conspiracy theories, or I don't believe that anybody is running the world. I think it has a life of its own. I think that I agree with you. The major task is the task of working on oneself, but not entirely to the exclusion of social responsibility. The major contribution most people can make in the theater of social responsibility is clarity of thought and intention. The general tone of the discussion arises out of the quality of the people participating in it. And you can reach most people if you will start with something that they're familiar with and then try and lead them out of it. I mean, I'm amazed in all the years that I've been talking about the things that I talk about, I have never been heckled, ever. No one has ever stood up quaking with righteous wrath and quoted chapter and verse or denounced me. And it's because I will argue with anybody unto the 9th hour, if necessary. I really think that the best ideas will come to the fore. I mean, who among us cannot think back on our own behavior to moments that hardly exemplify the Gaian ethic? So then how can we expect more or anything better than that from other people? The real task, I think, is one of linking together through communication, which people don't realize when they're not communicating. But what we're doing right now, this is a very unusual activity. Even the most intelligent of us go through our ordinary day basically with grunts and groans. That's how we signal to each other. But creating a shared mind space, a consensus of understanding, requires people talking to each other and clearly speaking from the heart about what they know and understand. Ralph introduced me to the notion of clairparlance. This is a psychic ability that we're trying to cultivate. Clairparlance is clear speech You know, William Blake said the truth cannot be told so as to be understood without being believed. That's the greatest weapon the truth has. That if it is articulated and you hear it, you will serve it. And so will George Bush, and so will anybody else who hears it. The power of the truth is its immediate, limpid rightness. And so cognitive activity, and this really goes back to the theme of the weekend, which is shamanism. To my mind, what shamans really are people who indulge in cognitive activity. They communicate, they dance, they sing, they chant, they tell stories, they speak out, they orate, they pray, they communicate. And in so doing, they empower everyone around them to open their hearts and their minds.
Reagan was a shaman, or is a shaman.
Oh yes, it's stage magic. And there is this, and you can't understand why it works. And it is morally neutral. This is the other thing. I mean, Goebbels, you can forget Ronald Reagan. This is a piker and a buffoon. Joseph Goebbels was a man who understood the power of information and communication. And if he believed the best idea wins, then he can only shake his head at the fate that overtook his ideas. Because here was a millennial dream that 12 years after it was launched, people were living in basements on rats. So it's a matter of allowing the ideas to fully express themselves through us. We can only advance into the future at the rate at which we can transform our language. And we can only transform our language by working with it. This is why design and art and music and all of these things are so important. The artist, who appears to be the weakest among us, actually creates the context for everything to happen in. So that it's so bizarre to hear right-wing politicians, for instance, talk about terms like spin and hype. And, I mean, they use the language by grafting certain concepts onto the language. You make it impossible for people not to agree with you. You actually foreclose the option of disagreement. They know this, and we know this. So this is the theater where the battle goes back and forth, to say what the world is in such a way that you convince everyone, and then we can get down to the business of living in that world. And history really is this process of trying to generate a guiding image that serves. And so someone, Christ, Mohammed, Buddha, will project the guiding image, and it gels in the unconscious and becomes a creode, and a vast set of historical forces follow it the way water follows a dry arroyo. But then the way is lost. It's not clear which direction the flow should go. Then there must be a new guiding image. And I think that the guiding image that we have been operating under, which is the property-owning male citizen, is giving way to a new guiding image, which is the planetary steward androgyne shaman. And this image reconnects us to nature, reconnects us to the lost part of ourselves, and will serve then until circumstances change, and then it too will have to yield to some new definition, because we are ultimately malleable. We are like water. We take upon ourselves the shape of the container into which we are poured. And this is what history is the flowing from one container to another.
I think that I wanted to just connect.
Sure.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you to comment on remark you made this morning about anticipating the future and how information drifts back through time. Could you say more about that?
I thought you would never ask.
Could you repeat the question?
What it refers to my comment this morning that a portion of shamanism is the anticipation of the future by accessing information which drifts backward through time. Well, I think my interpretation of what religion is, other than the scheming of eunuchs, is there is something there. There is something there transcendent and compelling. And what it is I think, an anticipation of a future event, an anticipation of a future state of human completedness, that actually ahead of us in time, our destiny, whatever it is casting an enormous shadow backward into what we call history. And that in fact one way of thinking about history is as the shock wave which precedes an eschatological event. 100,000 years ago, there was no intimation of an eschatological event. There were simply hunters and tribalism and animal existence embedded in the life of the planet. Then slowly there has grown, like an ever-increasing downward rolling boulder, a momentum of intuition that there is something, a great change is in store for us, that we are all going to become enlightened, or that the Messiah is going to come, or that the extraterrestrials are going to rescue us from ourselves. The intimation of a sudden shift of epoch and an ingression into ordinary history of the transcendental. Now, some psychologists might say this is nothing more than the culture's reaction to the inevitable fact of death, that every one of us will recapitulate this process, that death itself is like an enormous shadow at the end of life, sending a flickering signal back through our existence. And when you're young, death seems far away and has no power. But as you live your life, you suddenly realize that the walls are growing steeper, the water is moving swifter. There is a kind of inevitability, and that you don't want to stare this inevitability in the face. Well, I think the historical process is like that, and that we are in the grip of what I call a singularity, that it is cultural, that the evolution of techne to become an ever more limpid mirror of the self is turning into a kind of process where we are becoming the objects of our imagination. We are, through cultural evolution, actually creating our own eschatology. You know, Plato said if God didn't exist, man would invent him. Well, there are many different kinds of gods for humanity to invent. And one of the most satisfying, I think, is this eschatological hypostatization that lies outside of history and informs it. This is what the seers are reacting to. This is what inspires the careers of the prophets. And it is, I maintain, what shamanism is about. We've offered many definitions of shamanism here. Here is another one. A shaman is someone who has seen the end. That's all. Once you've seen the end, it's like going with a friend to a movie that you've seen and they haven't. You have a completely different relationship to it. You are anticipating their enjoyment of it, their moments of fear, anticipation, and pleasure, but you are above them looking down. You have already seen the end. You know the punchline. And every shaman in every culture gains his or her humor, balance, healing ability, wisdom, if you will, by having participated in the transhistorical eschatological object. And Modernity just denies this. The theory of history taught in the universities is what's called the trendlessly fluctuating theory. That just means war, revolution, reform, revolution, war, war, reform, revolution. It's like a random walk across the landscape with a steady increase of technique, rising Malthusian pressures, but that's all. It's because there is no place for the transcendent in the scheme of rationalism as we inherit it from the late, from the Enlightenment. But in fact, if what the psychedelic experience argues, what our dreams argue, what our good sense argues, is that it is not business as usual on this planet. And history is not a random walk that has tens of millennia yet to run ahead of it. That actually we have set off processes that finalize our time upon the earth, finalize the duration of our present cultural mode. We are going to have to fish or cut bait. We have built this into our myths about our world, that it has an ending. And so it shall. And I think shamanism anticipates this superhuman condition out of which we arose in ilio tempore, before history, and into which we shall be subsumed at the end of the historical peregrination. The myth of our culture is the myth of the prodigal son. We made the descent into physis, into the world of matter, into the well of the world, if you wish. Our job to recover a piece of lost information about the nature of the soul and then return to the tribal family, to the shamanic, prehistoric and post-historic mode where then the fruits of history will be not thanatoptic in their consequences, but transformative. Anticipation of the future.
Follow on that. I'm thinking of the second book of the I Ching and asking that question about reversibility of time, going both ways. And also, in that second book, there's an interesting comment on the actually the contrast or complementarity of creativity and transformation. Was to suggest that they're processes that flow counter to one another. Could you?
Well, I think the I Ching is a special obsessive interest of mine, specifically the kinds of things you're talking about. There is this body of commentary that is pre-Confucian, late Zhou, early Han, that is puzzling in the present context of the I Ching. And I think this is what you're referring to. And there's a place where it says, the backward running numbers refer to the future. The forward running numbers refer to the past. And you say, well, what does this mean? There are no backward running or forward running numbers. There are just 64. No, it's because the I Ching as we possess it today is a piece of broken machinery. It is actually an extremely sophisticated understanding of time, couched in an intellectual and epistemic domain that we can barely cognize because it arises out of a different kind of language stratum. But really, I think being is a kind of interference pattern where the forward-flowing casuistry of what are called prepotent situations, like the rolling downhill of a ball bearing, the momentum of happenstance, where the momentum of happenstance meets this more mysterious carrier wave from the future, and together they form an interference pattern. I remember I was very impressed where the Amazon River flows into the Rio Negro. These are both huge rivers. They're each about 12 miles across where they meet each other. And so consequently, they are like two waves coming together. And where they meet, they form a standing wave. And you can actually sail up to this bump in the river. And it's quite large. I mean, it's 5 or 6 feet high. And you can sail along it. It's like a ridge in the middle of the river. And you can see that all the material is in motion, but the wave itself is stable. It is what is called a standing wave. And I think that this is what being is. Science has attempted to give a very full account of the forward-moving momentum of happenstance. But we deny that there is appetition for the future, or that the future is somehow shaping events. And in our denial, we are then left with a blind spot in our account of reality. I'm going to teach a 5-day workshop at Esalen the week after Thanksgiving, in which psychedelics will barely be mentioned. And the I Ching and its mathematical dynamics will be the entire focus of this, because I take this notion very seriously and have worked it out in excruciating detail, because I think that the wave form of the Tao can be known and was known, and that there are technologies of interior observation, which is what yoga is, but Taoism in its early and incipient phase was a similar kind of technology, that allow real insight into the future. The future is not determined. If it were, thought would be meaningless. But it has, it's like water flowing over a dry arroyo. The water takes the shape of its container, and the water of historical happenstance flows into the vessel of the future, which already exists, and takes its shape.
Comment on the opposition of creativity and transformation in that same chapter?
Yeah, I'm not so sure about... you see those as opposed?
I thought that one led to the other, but in reading that, it seems that there's some question, and I'm puzzled by it.
Well, I think you have to read the I Ching with a grain of salt. I mean, why does before completion come after completion? There are a number of puns. I mean, it can be read as very deep, but not without humor, I think. And it is, Taoistic thinking is inherently contradictory. The coincidentia oppositorum used to create cognitive dissonance. So you never have the satisfaction of logical closure that you get in Hegel or somebody like that. You're always left not sure, not knowing. Puzzling. And all myths that are authentic and haven't been rewritten for daytime television maintain a kind of dreamlike, surreal quality. And so I'd like to tell you a story that I came upon a few months ago and was delighted. And I tell it to you in the hope that you can perhaps help me to understand it. Like all good stories, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But I felt that there must be something important in it because it was very easy to memorize. So that clued me to the fact that there must be something in it. And this story comes from that ultimately pivotal moment in Western civilization when the last outpost of the goddess culture, which was Crete, Minoan Crete, fell and was in the process of falling to the pirate paternalists of Mycenae, who, with advances in shipbuilding and an economic base built on grain, were beginning to conquer the eastern Mediterranean, and one by one the last bastions of the goddess religion were falling. There were also great earthquakes in the eastern Mediterranean at this time, which also contributed to the disruption of this civilization. And the story that I want to tell is a story that occurs from the very oldest stratum of Greek mythology. This is not about the pantheon of classical or even Doric Greece. This is an older story, Mycenaean, perhaps older than that, going back even to the pastoralists coming out of Africa and into the Fertile Crescent. It's a story set in a setting which is probably familiar to most of you, although this story is only told in Pausanias and alluded to in Herodotus, so it is not a story that even classicists are too familiar with. Robert Graves, in his 4-volume study of Greek mythology, gives it only passing reference. You may recall that King Minos was the king of Crete, and that he was most famous for having built a labyrinth in which to house the Minotaur. And I'm sure you know the story of the traversing of the labyrinth. And perhaps you know that King Minos built the labyrinth, had need of it, because his wife, Queen Pasiphae, was an extremely sensuous and experimentally minded young woman. And she became so interested in the sexual habits of cattle that she had Icarus, the craftsman who was later to break out of this scene on the Daedalus, the guy who was going to break out of this scene later on the first flying machine. She had him fashion for her an artificial cow in which she hid in order to have sexual union with the bulls in the royal flock. And out of this hanky-panky came the Minotaur. And her husband, trying to cover up this series of faux pas, built the labyrinth, installed the Minotaur in the labyrinth, and they grew older and did less swinging and began to settle down. But then comes the story I want to tell, which is a few years later, the king and the queen, apparently under quite normal conditions, conceived a child who was in due time born. And this child's name was Glaucus. Glaucus means blue-gray, and is to this day a term preserved in taxonomy to describe the blue-gray color typical of the peyote cactus and of the bruising reaction of psilocybin mushrooms. And young Glaucus had the run of the royal palace at Knossos. And in his 6th year, he was exploring the pantries of the palace, and he discovered a huge urn filled with honey. And he took the lid off the honey urn and was reaching into it and fell into the honey and was drowned and died there. And no one knew what had become of the son of the king and the queen. And there was tumult, as you can imagine, in the court. And eventually Queen Pasiphae, in a state of complete hysterical distraction, went to the great seer who advised the king's generals and the king's weather makers. And she said, "You must find our son." And the seer looked into the surface of oils poured on water and burned hyssop leaves. And he said, "My magic is not sufficient to find your son, but I can lead you to one who can find your son." He said, "The person," and this is the part of the myth which is so bizarre that you suspect that there must be textual corruption or some kind of misunderstanding because it's so weird what follows. The seer said, the person who can lead you to your son is that person who can compose the most apt simile on the tricolored cow in your herds. What the tricolored cow is, what kind of code language we're dealing with, can only be a matter of conjecture. But obviously the story at this point is couched in a secret language which conveyed meaning only to the initiates. So the king and the queen commanded each citizen of the principality to appear before them and compose a simile on the tricolored cow. And there was a man there, a minor philosopher, whose name was Polyeidos. And Polyeidos, you only have to have spent 2 weeks in Greek before you transferred out to something a little less horrifying to know that Polyeidos means many ideas. So Polyeidos, the man of many ideas, went before the court and he proposed a simile, which, according to the account of Pausanias, was brilliant. He doesn't preserve it, and hence it's lost forever. But whatever this simile was, it carried the day. And Polyeidos was actually a very humble man, a minor healer and magician. And he was puzzled that out of all the people in the kingdom, he had been chosen, or he had, by fate, been singled out as the one who could solve this extremely racking dilemma of the lost son for the king and queen. And he said to the king, I have no idea how to go about this, how to find your son. And the queen flew into a rage and said, he should be sealed into a crypt with the body of our son. And he can come out when he comes out with our son alive. And so Polyeidos was seized by force. And notice now the motifs of incarceration, the dark night of the And as Polyeidos sat there bewailing his fate and rending his clothes and calling out on the gods to help him, a snake entered the chamber through some unseen tiny chink. And the snake approached the corpse of the child lying in a dripping pool of presumably dark attic honey on the polished stone of the sarcophagi. And Polyeidos emerged out of his reverie and struck out at the snake and killed it because he was afraid it would violate the body of the child. And then, seeing that the snake was dead, he went back to his reverie. And a few minutes later, a second snake appeared and came to the body of the first snake and reacted very violently. And before Polyeidos could move to catch it, quick as a wink, it was across the room and lost through a small aperture in the floor. And hours passed, and the depth of Polyeidos' despair grew and multiplied as he realized the hopelessness of his situation. And then, suddenly, the second snake appeared again. And this time, it was carrying in its mouth a branch of a small herb. And it approached the corpse of its companion and regurgitated the branch into the mouth of the dead snake. And the dead snake was revived, and the two snakes went away. And Polyeidos was struck dumb with amazement. And he called to his jailers, and he described this herb to them, which was well known to him for its use in other medical matters. And the herb was brought to him, and he chewed it up, and he regurgitated it into the mouth of the corpse of young Glaucus. And the child was revived. And Polyeidos' ass was saved. So he emerged, and the king and the queen were jubilant, and the court was jubilant, and the king said, "You can have anything that you wish." And Polyidus, who was actually a foreigner in Crete, said, "I want to journey to my homeland. I want to return to my homeland." And King Minos was on the brink of granting the boon when Queen Pasiphae intervened and whispered in his ear and said, "You cannot allow a magician of this power to leave the kingdom. We must somehow gain his knowledge before we allow him to depart from us." And so King Minos backtracked and made a different deal and said, "You can return to your homeland, but first you must teach all your magical arts to my son Glaucus, who you have resurrected." And so Polyidus, not liking it, but seeing the power of the king, acceded to the demand. And over the course of many years, he taught all his shamanic and magical arts to Glaucus, and he schooled him in all of the esoteric knowledge that had made Polyidus the unique person able to find the lost child. And finally, he went to the king and said, "I have taught all I know to your son. Now fulfill your promise and allow me to leave your kingdom." And so the king was agreed. And on the appointed day of departure, a royal retinue accompanied Polyidus to the quay where he was to grab the boat out to Syracuse. And they were embracing, and the last goodbyes were being said. And finally it only remained for Polyidus to make his departure to Glaucus. And he approached Glaucus, and he said, as my pupil, as the one that I have initiated, I have one last request. It is that now at our farewell, you spit into my mouth. And Glaucus thought it was a bizarre request, but he did as his master bade him, and Polyidus boarded the ship, and they cast off and sailed away. And as the royal family was standing on the quay looking out to sea, Glaucus realized that all the magical information that had been given to him over the years had been contained in the glob of spittle, and that the master had reclaimed his knowledge and sailed away. So that's the story of Glaucus and Polyidus.
One sort of funny part is that in the original, at first you said they couldn't find the body, and then you said they knew where the body was and needed to revive him.
Oh yeah, I blew the story. Polyidus, once chosen, he dreamed and saw the body in the honey, but they were so flipped out that the kid was dead that the fact that he had found the body didn't buy him much slack. Yes, thank you for clarifying that. Now, the reason, let me say a little bit about it, is a very interesting story. I found it while I was searching for proto-Hellenic myths related to mushrooms. And there's something funny going on in this story. The fact that the blue-gray child is preserved in the honey and then is resurrected through the intercession of another herb, an herb known to the snake. And recall from the Genesis myth that the snake is always the keeper of the vegetable secrets. It was the snake who had the inner skinny on the flora and fauna of Eden. And so the snake comes bearing information that then concerns this herb of immortality and the ability to resurrect the dead. And it shows, I think, the very late persistence of these Paleolithic themes of shamanic power carried and transmitted through plants. If any of you have any other insight into this, why perhaps in the afternoon.
Glaucus may have been eaten a mushroom and gone into some kind of coma state where he appeared dead, and then the task was to revive him. So they found an herb that restores people who are apparently dead. In the Gilgamesh story, there's also an herb of immortality that the snake absconds with. And the snakes have always been especially credited with knowing the secret of regeneration because of they slopping their skin and all that.
Well, you know, people in Mexico who go to Huatla and places like that and collect the mushroom, the on-the-road, old-style way of preserving the mushrooms was to put them in honey. And it turns into a totally black mess. It turns into the alchemical prima materia. It turns into the exudate of the grave. But if you have the courage to eat it, it is then reborn inside of you. And honey, the role of honey as well, any of you have read Levi-Strauss, Honey and Ashes and the Raw and the Cooked, know that, this is a symbol of semen, of sunlight, of sweetness. I mean, it's a very rich kind of symbol. There are even, it's reputed, hallucinogenic honeys in the Amazon. This is a whole unexplored area where nobody has ever been able to walk into a laboratory and slam down a quart jar of hallucinogenic honey, but there are persistent reports filtering back from wild-eyed travelers. The metaphor of honey, the manas from heaven, yes.
Do you recommend preserving mushrooms in honey?
No, I don't recommend preserving mushrooms in honey if you have a good freeze dryer and modern refrigeration. But otherwise, you see, the honey draws the moisture out and it like candies it and crystallizes it and makes it impervious. Honey is highly antibiotic. Nothing rots that is immersed.
You have to eat all the honey? Parents, can
Yeah.
you make sure that they actually talk into the microphone?
Yes.
These questions.
Mr. Coffey is going to... You had a story to tell. No? Oh, I tailored myself to your needs, sir. Now I have nothing to say.
Come on, you got back out.
Yes, he can, as a matter of fact. Well,
She has a joke.
a joke.
It's a deathbed joke. When I was deathing my father, a couple of days before he died, he told me a dream. He woke up and he said that he was sitting on the top of the peaks, and the elders came and gave him the beads, and they contained the secrets of the universe, and they went through the rosary of all the beads and showed him all the secrets of the universe. And he understood that he was going to die, and that he'd been given this gift before he died. And then they left him there, telling him that they would see him. And he looked down in the beads, and he couldn't remember any of the secrets of the universe.
Yes, well, there's something about dreams where meaning, puns, or some great truth is portrayed, but it can never be quite brought back. And it seems simple, silly, profound, but mostly difficult to remember. And a friend of mine, the closest to my mind that anybody ever came to capturing this, was a friend of mine told me about a dream he had that was very complex, and many, many things happened, but in the final scene there was a raft covered with Edwardian furniture and naked mermaids, and it was floating out to sea, and the mermaids were waving to my friend who stood on the beach, and the last thing he heard them call out to him was, "Deja vu! Deja vu!" I said, "This sounds like it means something." Well, anyone who wishes to say, I mean, you don't have to feel constrained. You have to feel constrained. No, I'm sure.
American Buddha says that snakes are the goddess. Any symbol of the snake that you see in archaic something or other is the goddess.
Well, too bad Maria Gimbutas can't mud wrestle Sigmund Freud. sure, the
I'd like
caduceus.
to invite people also in terms of telling stories. Also, dreams, I think, would be, often do contain good stories. And you might search your memory, particularly for dreams. I mean, I have a personal interest. I think it kind of ties in with the theme of this weekend and this theme of the wild man or the wild woman, the wild creature, the half animal, half human part of our own nature. If you ever had a dream about that seemed to be about such a being, this would be a very significant dream, very centrally related to what we're talking about here.
There was a book published very recently that I enjoy plugging because the guy is so perverse. And, he's a post-structuralist, Marxist, Jacques Derrida, labor organizer, rationalist type. But he wrote an amazing book about ayahuasca called Shamanism, Colonialism, and the Wild Man. And if you want to be plunged into the world of real shamanism as it is practiced today among very sophisticated people, I mean, this guy got it. His name is Michael Taussig, and you have to take off your hat to this guy because being an anthropologist at the University of Chicago and a Marxist, he took it over and over and over again, not sipping it. He actually, just got flattened with these people and talks about it and just throws out the gauntlet to orthodox anthropology. And he's no true believer. This is no Carlos Castaneda. This is somebody very few of us here would actually be comfortable with, because you can tell this guy is abrasive, thinks everybody else is a moron, thinks people who hear voices should see a psychiatrist, and yet you get the whole thing. It's all there. It's interesting, in the case of Iboka, there's no known reference to it before 1850. So this is like a use of a hallucinogen in a tribal context for which there is no evidence of great age at all. The peyote use over a widespread area is also similar. The older strata of archaeological digs in the southwest seems to indicate that peyote use came in fairly late. This brings up a point that I wanted to make in discussing and imaging the figure of the shaman, which is not to get into a naive cult of the wild man. Some of you may know the book The Rio Tigre and Beyond by Manuel Córdoba Ríos, or it's by F. Bruce Lamb, but it's about Manuel Córdoba Ríos, who was a great ayahuasquero, and he describes going on curare collecting and rosewood collecting expeditions into really uncontacted tribal areas in the Amazon, and there he would meet people brewing ayahuasca, completely bare-assed, scarified, hunter-gathering types, and they didn't know how to do it. And it was weak. He took it with them, and it was just a stone drag. So if you know the book, you know that he himself had this history of involvement with ayahuasca. So he made it for them the way he thought it should be made and showed them how to make it. And they had no resistance at all. They said, "My God, you really know how to do this. Our whole culture will now be different. You know, we've just been making weak tea." So there is this thing about how the real access to the shamanic mystery is a shifting doorway. You never know where you're going to find it. When we were in the Amazon in '83, we were dealing with pretty authentic tribal people and asking them about these orally active DMT drugs. And the best they could do was to say, well, I saw my grandfather make it a couple of times before he died, and he died 20 years ago, but I think I could make it. The tradition was just in the act of fading away. But then, among the pharmacology students of the Université Nacional de Peru, we found that with the help of Harvard Museum botanical leaflets, they had reconstructed these aboriginal drugs so that they were extremely powerful and hit the mark every time. So shamanism is not, the depth of a shaman's authenticity is not measured by the authenticity of the culture. The woman or man who is a shaman, it depends on their unique personality. My brother once suggested that a good definition for a shaman would be an extra-environmental, and that this is the attitude to cultivate. Be a stranger everywhere. Always stand on the outside. Always be the alien. And you will have the proper attitude for furthering in yourself the tendencies that make you into a person who sees deeply into reality. Another way of thinking about a shaman is it's a person, this is the definition I created when my son was much younger, and he asked me, what is a shaman? And I said, a shaman is a person who knows how the world really works. And this is the task of every one of us, to find out how does it really work? How does it really work? You inherit always a cultural model, which is relatively trivial and idiotic, and in all complex situations will fail you. So how does the world really work? And to what degree does the cultural model stand in the way rather than serve as a springboard too? In the case of our own culture, I think quite a bit. It's interesting to try and understand how this kind of knowledge could ever be lost. I mean, like Soma is a good example. I mean, the whole of the Rig Veda, especially the 9th mandala of the Rig Veda, is just this ecstatic hymn to Soma, to some kind of intoxicating plant juice thing that was expressed in a series of pumps and grinders, that was the central mystery of this invading Indo-European civilization for a couple of thousand years. And then around 1000 BC, for inexplicable reasons, even the knowledge of what this plant was seemed to be lost. Well, how can such information that is so central to a full experiencing of human potential, once found, ever be forgotten? And I think that the only scenario that I've been able to come up with that would account for something like that is if you have a visionary plant and it's used by the population, but then you specialize and create a professional class that uses it, and then that professional class makes it illegal for all other classes. And then the professional class which is using this entheogen coincidentally is also the ruling class. Well, then when the lower echelons of society have had enough of being ruled, then there are slave revolts and popular uprisings, and the priestly class that held this secret as its own source of power is probably wiped out to the last bald-headed priest, and with them dies the information. So the holding close of the information is the first step toward losing it. Genesis. I mean, basically the story of this struggle over access to a plant. And the first prohibition, you can do anything you want, but do not eat of the fruit of this plant. And then, you will become as him you will know your true condition in the cosmos. Well, is it that you will know your true condition in the cosmos, or is it that you will be cast down into an unending and eternal hell unto the 1000th generation? This is essentially Nancy Reagan's position. So the issue is knowledge. The true, if you look for an archetype of the shaman in the Western pantheon, the archetype of the psychedelic user, it has to be Prometheus. It is Prometheus who steals the fire from divinity and carries illumination down to the human species.
In a fennel stalk.
And for that, must suffer the most outlandish torture and indignity ever dreamed up by the Western imagination. So it is not a metaphor that we are in a state of symbiotic abandonment to our mother. It isn't a symbolic statement at all. It is simply a true statement that we are so far out into the history game that we don't understand this, that our ennui, our existential angst is all because we don't know jack shit about what's going on. And the reason we don't is because we have accepted prohibitions against finding out what's going on. We are infantile, as a matter of fact. Our whole spiritual engine of transcendence is infantile. It rests on the daddy figure, who is the priest, the guru, the wise man, some beady-eyed character from Bengal or elsewhere who's going to just straighten us all out. There is a complete kind of wrong-headedness that we have inherited as part of our historical legacy. It's that we do not value direct experience. We do not trust ourselves. We do not pay attention to the immediate input from the living world. We are always casting away from ourselves. What do the experts say? What did Buddha say? What did Plato say? What did somebody on the other side of the world? What are they saying now? We give ourselves away. And the reason is because we are bereft. You know that phenomenon of the 40-year-old guy with the sports car and 3 marriages behind him? This guy is desperate. He is bereft. And this, it has to do, I maintain, and I become less and less tolerant of any other view, which is either a sign that I'm slowly losing my mind, or I'm slowly eventually I'll just be like John Lilly, I just won't give a shit, really say what I think. But I really believe that authentic shamanism is psychedelic shamanism. And then people say, and nobody's said it yet, but it's okay to say it, can't you get there some other fasting? That I'm not saying that you can't push consciousness around, and I'm not saying that you cannot induce psycholytic states of self-recognition, states of abandonment of neurotic behavior patterns and that sort of thing. Certainly these things happen, but this informing impossible mystery, this thing which need not exist at all, so far as we can tell. It is entirely a gratuitous mystery, this informing sense of the other that approaches us with poetry and jeweled machines and visionary vistas of the far future and lost races in space and biological destinies possible but untried. That is not approachable any other way. And I think, that all this lineage mumbo-jumbo and the close holding of secrets means you don't have a strong hand. If you're holding your hand close to your chest, it's because you're afraid to play it. And the shamanism that is happening at the most primitive cultural level is shamanism that is willing to show its hand. I mean, they don't tell you that you're not pure enough or celibate enough or haven't mastered textual proficiency enough. They just say, yes, come with us into the woods, and we will show you what we know. And what we know is that we don't know nothing. And this is how we found that out. We found it out by putting ourselves at the mercy of something that we absolutely cannot understand, something which cannot be boiled down to serve ideology. This horse cannot be broken. Any priest who tries to ride it will be thrown for a loop. Any politician who tries to ride it will be trampled beneath it. It is a true mystery. And the male ego, that reductionist, Newtonian, Cartesian, positivist approach, always pushes for closure. There is never satisfaction unless there is explanation. And yet explanation is a fool's game. Anybody can create an explanation. The history of thought is the history of one cockeyed explanation after another, which is immediately perceived as ludicrous once it becomes outmoded. So the mystery is not an unsolved problem. It is a true mystery. Nobody knows what is going on. I don't think any tradition has taken the measure of this or operates in the light of it. The people who actually handle the molten alchemical ore that pours out of the furnaces of hyperspace have very little to say about it, have no interpretation to offer. It's the public relations people and the priestcraft people and the people who have a book they're selling. They are just full of information, explanation, denunciation, adoration, so forth and so on. But the people who stand close to the mystery are silent. And what I would like to put across, and what I'm always trying to put across, and what is very hard to put across even though we say it over and over again, is how real what we're talking about is. It is real. It can just shake your teeth out. It is very fine to sit under the teaching tree and talk about psychedelic drugs. Do you know how much this is like being smashed on a psychedelic drug? Not at all. Not one iota. Because what is required in the actual confrontation of the thing is that all this theory, all this tradition, all this self-examination is brought in to the focus of the moment. It is existentially real. You are being tried and you are being tested by a thing and an agency that you cannot know. And this is very different from getting a laugh from an audience or a paycheck from an institution or your book reviewed in the newspaper. That is all dross and foolishness, because we all know that there are weasels everywhere and that your position in human society is no indication of your existential validity. But if you can pass through the fire of the psychedelic experience, and it is a fire, the hexagram Li, the clinging, is the sign of the psychedelic experience. It is the noetic fire. It's the fire that descended on Pentecost and gave language to the apostles. If you can pass through that fire, then you have made a pact outside of history, outside of the validations and value systems of men and women. You have found authentic being. And it's a great challenge, a great controversy. People, react differently. They want to preserve this particular tradition which mitigates against it, that particular tradition which mitigates against it. The fact is, we can only say what we know. And I diligently sought existential validity in the various rumored Sophic oases in the landscape of human aspirations, such as yoga, such as sitting, such as, and it's just a matter of shopping around, and finding out what actually sets your knees knocking, what actually makes tears of joy run down your face spontaneously, what actually can make you grovel and plead for mercy. And it is this force, this real invocation of real spirit. It is a dark night of the soul. It is an ecstasy, apotheosis, apokatastasis. It even happens outside of Greek. It is pure challenge met and overcome, pure self-authentication. And in a world where we are just buffeted, used, set against one another, misled, misconstrued, lied to, and controlled, nevertheless, you can just push between the tents of Carnival Row and walk out into the woods, and there you find the spiritual life waiting. There you find the limpid Sophic waters of the Tao that were always there. And it's a matter of courage, not of finding the guru, not of seeking the answer. Anybody who is seeking the answer is in flight from the answer, because the answer is not sought, it is faced. You know what it is. You just have to face the demands that it will make upon you, because it isn't easy. Somebody isn't going to pass by your prostrate form and touch you on the head and tell you you're enlightened. It's going to be burned out of you the way the dross is burned away from the precious metal in the alchemical furnace. It takes courage and commitment and a willingness to make what Plotinus called the flight of the alone to the alone. This is what shamanism is about. We do have a good time with each other. We do have a good time with all these drugs and copulating furiously upon them and making metaphors with them. But the truth is that it is the narrow neck that challenges us, and the narrow neck that authenticates us. And when you pass through it, each time you come to the other side, you've taken a step along the path of knowledge that is irrevocable. You are not set back. Nature loves courage. Nature is an infinitude of doorways, opening into authentic being, calling to us with the voice of our ancestors, the spirits of the planet, the time travelers that rove the centuries ahead of us, and who knows what else. The whole fact of being is a palpable, ongoing, continuous miracle. And we know this. We feel it. But we are the programmed victims of a death-dealing society. So our task becomes, I think, to use the empowerment that these kind of gatherings give us, and to use the self-recognition that we can each have here, that we are not alone. That, I'm saying this because I'm glib, but we all know it. That's how I'm able to say it. It is elicited from the group mind. If it weren't in you, I would be incomprehensible. So we form then an understanding. And then we each are strengthened in the private trials of our souls when we go to meet these things, when we try to hammer out a relationship to the ally, when we try to hammer out a relationship to the denizens of our own unconscious. This is life authentically lived. And I'm sure that you're probably like me in that you come to these kind of gathering points from a much more mundane life, a life of a scramble for sustenance and whatever career mongering we're all doing. I mean, very few of us have a chance to keep the white-hot image of ourselves as a skywalker in front of us. But nevertheless, this is the fact. This is the internal myth that drives us and delivers knowledge and delivers authentic being. And it takes a very, very small number of people to make a change, especially when the change is not resisted. Because what we're saying is not menacing to the establishment. It's utterly incomprehensible to the establishment. So we can formulate in our benign neglect, we can formulate our own self-image. And when finally in the chaos of the world, we are asked for what our answer would be, what solution we would propose, it will be all there, all finished, ready and waiting. This is how mutation, real mutation, occurs in biological populations. It isn't that there's a mutation and suddenly it works better and so it takes over. No, it's that the mutation is always there in the background and is never significant until the conditions change. It gets dry, it gets wet. Suddenly, those mutant genes that allowed an organism to survive in wetter or drier conditions make all the difference. So we are a residual mutation that will not die, that is carried along in the bloodstream of the beast. And every 20 or 30 years or so, like the hatch of locusts or the coming of some other natural phenomenon in the ecosystem of the planet, there are waves of reform and of transcendent hope. It begins in America with the transcendentalists. As part of that now, we have only to bide our time. This shamanic model is at the very centerpiece of the new society that will be constellated if there is to be any future society at all. The image that I always hold of all of this, because I try to be a rationalist and an optimist, and it's very difficult to be both, I think. But I don't think we ever slipped out from beneath the control of nature. No. That man is not some kind of abomination run amok inside what would otherwise be a very ordered and pleasant situation. It's that the planet itself is destabilizing. The last 10 million years have been more unstable, with more glaciations than the previous 100 million years. And the appearance of human populations is simply to the present moment, the most extreme example of the destabilizing forces loose on the planet. But evolution does not proceed at a steady rate. It appears to go faster and faster. And historical time is like the career of intelligence just putting the pedal to the floor, and you're pushed back in your seat and you begin to accelerate. This is what history is, and we are now accelerating at such a rate that, as Ralph very eloquently pointed out, there are processes in motion that are real and measurable, that show beyond a shadow of any controversy that we are living in times such as have never been known before. The dissolution of the ozone in the atmosphere, the clearing of the Amazon, the pandemic spread of diseases and information, the complete globalizing of the whole human family so that we essentially do live in a global village. What happens in Bangladesh and Argentina and Anchorage is all reported everywhere in the same day. The kind of ecocatastrophes that Ralph mentioned, the AIDS epidemic is one of these. The AIDS epidemic, like the spread of nuclear weapons, another epidemic, have been a wonderful stimulus to sober thought about our condition. And, I believe that the Chernobyl disaster in the Soviet Union was really what turned the Kremlin leadership toward rethinking their foreign policy, because the explosion of a single power plant was like dropping a drop of ink in a glass of water and watching the entire glass of water turn slightly gray. And we're talking about the atmosphere of the only planet suitable for human life that we know of. And people just said, my God, when 3 Mile Island nearly melted down, if it had melted down and the federal capital of the United States of America had to be relocated 100 miles to the south, this would be a more ecology-conscious nation today. I mean, we got through by the skin of our teeth. But the image that I think is large enough to contain the violence and the desperation of the situation and still offer some hope is the image of birth. That we are somehow the children of the planet. We are somehow its finest hour. And this may grate on some people as anthropocentrism, but I actually espouse a certain kind of modified anthropocentrism because I don't think we're like fruit flies and giraffes and even, God save us, dolphins and chimpanzees. There is something different about this species. The evolutionary biologists say what it is that we have maintained, we are omni-adaptive. The strategy of other animal species is to define a niche, a tight set of conditions, and then to perfectly occupy that niche. We don't do that. What we do is we redefine niches. We remake things so that we can go there. We dress ourselves so that we can inhabit the Arctic. We invent fire so that we can keep it with us, so forth and so on. We are some kind of experiment that nature is indulging herself in, an experiment with the efficacy of epigenetic codes. Previously, the coding system that has been ubiquitous throughout nature has been the evolutionary code of the nucleotides that form the codons of DNA, that code for the structure of proteins that then compete in a kind of structural environment of adaptability. But the epigenetic information that we carry through song, through writing, through dance, storytelling, and electronic media is a whole different ball game. We do not forget. We bind time. We bind the past. We anticipate the future. We are going hyperspatial. We are claiming a whole new dimension for biology that it never claimed before. Always before, biology has operated within the confines of the immediate moment. But with the invention of writing and mnemonic skills, and still more so with the proliferation of electronic media, we are actually becoming a fourth-dimensional kind of creature. Our past lives. Our future is somehow with us. And you'll recall early on I said that the shaman journeys through time. The shaman is the paradigmatic figure for the future state of all humanity. What is happening is a birth process. And in the same way that a fetus and its maternal matrix eventually must be parted, or else toxemia sets in and threatens the life of the mother and the infant, in that same way, we seem to have been groomed for metamorphosis into our own imaginations. This is where we are going, and this is what our peculiar cerebral, self-reflective property is about. Now, history is a wink of God's eye. 25,000 years maximum, a geological instant, which begins with people chipping stone flint and which ends with people walking through a violet doorway into, what? Galactic citizenship. A super civilization spread throughout space and time and through levels and continui that we can barely conceive of or imagine. I mean, we are like Paleolithic man staring dumbly into his campfire and seeing there the shimmering towers of Babylon and Memphis and Athens and Rome and New York and saying, you know, what is it? What is it? What is it? It seems so important, it looks so familiar, and yet it's utterly incomprehensible. Our future is our mystery. Our destiny is to live in the imagination, and the historical process that we're going through is not, I think, cause for despair, but it is a major transition point in the life of the entire planet. And I would like to think that 1,000 years from now, the planet will be empty of human life. That, you know, the forests will be creeping out into the grasslands. The animal populations will be stabilized. The sequestering of heavy metals will have been completed. And the planet, like a woman who has just given birth to an 11-pound baby, will just breathe an enormous sigh of relief. And we, following our shamanic inclinations, following the self-transcending image of shamanic flight that leads us to build space shuttles and starships and L5 colonies, we will have followed our imagination into the unimaginable vistas of artistic creation that are our true destiny and home. And we are now in transition, the most difficult part of any birth process. Blood is being shed, there's screaming and groveling and waves of tension sweeping through the planet, sweeping through the human population. But it is an anticipation of a higher, wider, freer, kinder kind of being that we have always held up as an ideal for ourselves with the notion of the shaman, the superman or woman who knows the secrets of the animals, moves with the subtlety of the wind, is always capable of appropriate behavior, is at home everywhere, and leaves no mark. It's our aspiration, it's our guiding image. What we need to do, I think, is articulate.
Leaves works of art.
Yes, it sheds works of art.
Leaves records.
We excrete ideas. We leave a contrail of artifacts as we move through time. And they, you know, they're rotting in the jungles of Belize and Guatemala. They're parched on the sands of Egypt and Iran. And there are more artifacts ahead of us. An endless shedding of our architectonic and imaginary dreams as we move toward the quintessence, which is the self, which is this transcendent object at the end of time that has cast this vast shadow over our dreams, our poetry, our aspirations, our art, our self-image. And we can each know this here and now. The psychedelics put you in on the joke. You no longer are caught in the unfolding drama. You have seen the end. You have acted as a go-between. You have discovered the way in which the world actually works. Well, now I'd like to hear from some of you, if we can tie this up for people. Sure. This gentleman. Oh, yes, microphone.
Well, I basically agree with a lot of things that you have been talking about, Terence, and giving the mass of thoughts and information, I'm trying to just answer and put some points out that I feel important in the whole context that you are talking about. One is just a simple thing in the beginning. You're talking about psychedelics. I didn't quite get whether you make a distinction between synthetic psychedelics and organically grown.
No, I make a definite...
Yes, I know that you make the difference, but within your talk you mentioned LSD at several times in a way that I got the impression that you look at LSD as something that is not synthetic.
Well, LSD is kind of a borderline case. I'm probably under the spell of Albert Hoffman's recent visit. LSD-like compounds occur in morning glories and were the basis for certain hallucinogenic rites among the Mayans and the Toltecs. LSD is a sort of a hybrid. Ultimately, I suppose I would be sort of anti-LSD because the problem with LSD is it's so easy to make a million hits. And a million hits is not a party. A million hits is a governmental problem. And that's what undid LSD, was the fact that it was so easy to manufacture truly society-disrupting amounts of it.
That was its main function. Most likely.
Well, but don't you think a burrowing from within strategy might have gotten further? Like, I believe that the reason Leary decided to use LSD in the Harvard experiments was because Michael Hollingshead made the case to him that they could manufacture so much of it. Leary's original inspiration was psilocybin, but there were physical constraints on its manufacture.
Oh yeah, the facts are, I just think that, you know, I might not have done it that way, but that's the way it happened, and that seems to have been what the historical process came up with. Something that could be manufactured, could be in large amounts, giving hundreds of thousands of people access to an experience that before only a few had had. So, like, reaching that kind of 100th monkey, mass quantum, mass action threshold.
I mean, thinking in these quantitative terms is a very male thing, and I just wanted to put this question because my experience with my own experience, as well as what I have seen in many other cases with other people taking LSD, is that it is extremely affecting your body, and that it is creating confusion, possibly, and that you should at least take into consideration that it is developed by a Swiss company, and even Albert Hoffmann, who I really appreciate as a wise, nice old man, is a man still, and it is done in the whole context of patriarchal chemical work. Sandoz is destroying the River Rhine, and besides all these things, they have developed LSD.
Yes, well,
okay.
I tried
I just wanted to mention that
that
very briefly. It's not the main point that I wanted to come to.
Can I answer it anyway?
Sure.
Basically, I agree with you. I bend over backwards to be liberal because Ralph once accused me of being the most conservative person he knew. But I think you're right, that the fact that it can be manufactured means it can be manufactured badly. And what you want when you take a psychedelic is something that you know where it came from, you know what it is, and you don't have to worry about, were people orphaned, or did evil people manufacture this, or is the money being used to hold down black South Africans, or So I think plants, my advice to someone who takes it seriously, who wants to get right on this issue, is grow your own mushrooms. You should grow your own mushrooms for several different reasons. First of all, if you can successfully grow mushrooms, you probably can take them. Because in the process of growing them, it has taught you cleanliness, punctuality, attention to detail, all these traits which are very useful then when you take it. And then you know what you have. You've watched grain, rye, a human food, turn into pure psilocybin, and it all happened in your own basement. So no middlemen, no question of sources, no question of international chemical companies, so forth and so on. No, I think you're right to be very sensitive to this issue of synthesis, origins, and the karma of these things. But now go on.
Well, your answer is even an answer to my next point, which is that we have been talking a lot about whether or not taking drugs, which is, from my impression, not even a serious question for most of the people here. But the more important question that I found was not dealt with enough is the question how we take it. We live in a culture where we have not many tools or transmissions of knowledge how to use properly plants. And what you're just saying about mushrooms is a very good point, how we can learn to deal with something properly instead of just buying it and consuming it. And the last remark to this question of how, where I would like to hear maybe a few sentences from both of you, is the point that, because I think Ralph mentions the mysteries of Eloises at a certain point. And what I know, or one point that I remember is that people were only allowed once in their life to get this visionary experience. And you pointing out that the visionary experience is maybe the most important, I would say, I mean, in shamanic cultures, quite often it was just the shaman who would go for the visionary experience and then had the challenge to share that with his people, and not everybody was just going for a visionary experience. And what happened in the psychedelic movement was that everybody was going for visionary experience again and again and again and again, without, or even by doing that, losing his motivation of bringing his vision back to his life and to his people.
Well, people don't know how to do it, you're right. And so maybe it's useful. I mean, this is certainly tying up loose ends. I feel like this is where we really soar out toward the edge and stretch the envelope of the institution. But you must know how to do it, right? And so how you do it, in my humble opinion, but based on experience, is you, first of all, you take a committed dose. You don't take some namby-pamby, piddling, testing it out, toe in the water kind of dose. Because, you know, even in the gospel, Christ says, it's the lukewarm that I vomit out of my mouth. You know, don't bring me any dilettantes, no dabblers, no drugstore cowboys. So you take a committed dose. What is a committed dose? A dose that when you think about taking it, you feel fear. That's a committed dose. So you take a committed dose. And then you take it on an empty stomach. And then you take it in silent darkness. Leave your Walkman alone. Forget Mozart. Forget the Pink Floyd. Forget Bach's choral preludes. It's ridiculous. All that stuff sounds fine without these things. And this is heresy to some people. I mean, to some people it's all about choosing the music. Again, this selling out, you know, what the hell? You can't illuminate your mind without having a synthesizer diddling in the background. So, silent darkness, committed dose, empty stomach, and then it's very simple. You lay down, you shut up, you close your eyes, and you look at the back of your eyelids with the expectation that you may see something. Now, people have in describing this back to me, people have called that the McKenna method. which seems to me just, you must be nuts to think of it that way. Because I talked to someone, I won't name him, but a great researcher, widely published researcher in psilocybin. And he'd done 80 trips and given it to 25,000 people and so forth. And I said, well, what did you make of the hallucinations? And he said, I never closed my eyes. And I realized, that these guys are just quaking with terror. Committed dose in a shamanic situation. And and now I'm not advising this. This I do not advise, but this is how I do it. I do it alone. I have never understood the obsessive need people have to take drugs in groups. It just makes my flesh crawl. And the only time I've ever been able to do it comfortably was with Amazonian people and mestizo people where there was a language barrier. But if I take a psychedelic with somebody, then I listen to them breathing, and I hope they're all right, and I get all tangled up with, are they all right, and should I say something, should I not say something, and it just turns into this mother-hen thing that I can't stand. And often when I take psychedelics alone, I pass through a place where I say to myself, boy, I'm sure glad there's nobody else here, because I think this would really alarm them. At this point, people would be reaching for 411, and since I can't, it's not going to turn into an embarrassment for me. So I think, committed dose, silent darkness, empty stomach, lay down, shut up, be still. Keeping still, the I Ching says. It's all in keeping still.
Okay, so far to set and setting. And the last thing that I wanted to mention in this context, that from my own experience, there is more than just this set and setting and dosage, which has to do with the cleaning of the gates of, how do you say, Pforten der Wahrnehmung?
Perception, doors of perception.
Doors of perception, because in my own case, and again what I saw with many other people happening, is that if you still have some narcissistic patterns in your system or in your psyche, things, you first of all will have difficulties to stay in a place like you can do that. And what happened to many people is that they either got difficulties to handle that situation and would do all kinds of things that would damage themselves, or if they would go through, they would run around with some kind of omnipotent feelings. I mean, there is serious research being done about the fact that Hitler has taken mescaline and got some of his visions, so not through his dark and deep wounded soul, other than he did.
Well, eventually it becomes an aesthetic question. I mean, the trick with psychedelics, as with life generally, is to be in good taste. I mean, it is not tasteful to vomit on your partner or declare yourself the world messiah. This is embarrassing, and it's happening, but it's inappropriate. I just think, the rules don't change when you take psychedelics. You still, there's no license to be a jerk. The thing about narcissistic hang-ups and stuff like that, usually I just feel that the person hasn't done enough, and that sometimes you really have to clobber people, that the dose is insufficient.
I'd like to say something or ask directly about the subject of how to, which you've been discussing. And I'll say it in as quickly a way as possible so you can put your answer together the way you want. Potential problems in taking this. I've said to people, have you taken a lot? Have you ever seen this stuff? And they haven't quite been in the dark. I've gone out, and it's hard to find a place that's dark. There's a lot of lights everywhere.
Well, no, you don't go out. You just close the door and turn out the light.
Then the question is, I talked to Kat a little about this, and she said, no, don't do it in the city. You're absorbing all the vibes of everybody around you.
Well, it's true. We live in the country, but it doesn't have to be pitch. You just take your cone tent and go out to Joshua Tree and up a canyon and...
So you agree with the thing about not taking it in the city?
No, I think it's totally weird to take it in the city.
But
as long as, before we move on, one thing I'd like to say about technique, it may seem small here, but it someday may save you great wear and tear in a tight situation. And that is, if you get into a place in the psychedelic that is difficult, Western people seem to freeze at the controls. And what you need to do is sing and recognize that sound is a tool for pushing energy around. And you can just move past an unpleasant exhibit by chanting your way through it. And all the things that we're taught as spiritual tools, mantra, yantra, mudra, all these things which never work worth a damn most of the time, work perfectly in that state. In fact, that's probably what they were designed for. I mean, all these things are totally frustrating to me, but in the psychedelic state, yantra, mantra, chanting, singing, drumming, as advertised, can move you through these spaces. Let's give somebody else a chance. A woman back here, either Gigi or the lady in the...
It's not on.
It is.
Is it? Oh. I just had a question about ritual. You mentioned the Terence method and everything.
Disgraceful, but yes.
Yeah, well, it's good advice. But so I was wondering what other rituals you do repetitively other than just like the normal brushing your teeth kind. But do you
mean in my personal life?
Yeah. Is there anything that you do every day or every other, month that you just...
I spend as many hours a day as I possibly can smoking cannabis. This is a practice.
This is the secret of Terence McKenna's philosophy.
Thank you very much.
People,
this is a practice that I've adhered to since my 17th summer. And, God knows if I put in the same amount of time on yoga or writing plays. I also throw the I Ching at the new and full moon. What am I doing to decriminalize it? Well, I always talk about it whenever anybody asks. It's funny how rarely the subject comes up, even in groups like this. It's almost as though marijuana is the poor country cousin. We're all here talking about 5-methoxy, hydroxy, this and that. And the lowly cannabis weed, which has been with us since before the Vedas were a gleam in some Indo-European warlord's eye. It's very interesting how the metaphors of cordage are also the metaphors of creativity, that we weave a story and we spin a yarn. And all the connection between fibers and cognitive processes has always been well understood. I think cannabis has a bum rap. What I'm doing to decriminalize it is being fairly out front about my devotion to it. I just think it's trivial and silly, and it's like trying to outlaw masturbation or something. It has to do with having a torqued notion of human nature. These things exist. I'm not recommending that for everyone, but when I was young, I was what's called a nervous child. And the first time I had a hit of cannabis, I realized that I could self-medicate myself to normalcy and be just like everybody else. And so I did that, and I don't know if it's the proper place to tell it, but once I became concerned that I did too much smoking, and so I decided I would quit. First of all, I wanted to see if I could quit, And then I wanted to see how much of my interior life was actually riding on this ocean of cannabis ingestion. So it so happened that the conditions for the experiment were perfect because I was arriving on a small desert island in the Seychelles group in the Indian Ocean, and had rented a house on this island in order to write a book. So I had this Mombassan bomber weed and a lid of it, and I just rolled it up and nailed it above my kitchen door and decided that I would not smoke until I had finished writing this book. And was relieved to learn that I had enough self-control that this was possible. I mean, I didn't sleep a wink for 8 nights, but I did not resort to breaking my pledge, and I slowly realized it was all right. What it seemed to do was I spent a lot more time reading and had much more interesting dreams, and otherwise it didn't seem to be any big deal. And I wrote this book then, and it took me about 6 weeks, and I promised myself that when the book was finished, I would then allow myself to smoke up this lid of weed before I left this island. So finally I finished, and I was very diligent. I wrote every day at 8 a.m. for till noon. I typed, and then I would take my dogs and explore this island. I had this very set regimen. And finally the book was finished. And I rolled these huge bombers and dragged my lawn chair out under the coconut palms and waited for the sunset to get really going. And then I just flared and consumed about 3 of these things in about 5 minutes. And I was just waiting for this sense of relief and accomplishment and clarity to sweep over me. And this thing began to happen, and I pushed it away, and then it came back, and I pushed it away, and finally I realized I had to look at what this was, that it was just becoming overwhelming. And then I looked at it, and what it was the incontrovertible, instantaneous, deep, unarguable realization that this book I had written was dog shit. And I was just frozen just sitting in this chair quaking with this realization. And up to a half an hour ago, I had this vision of myself returning triumphantly to Berkeley like Lenin entering Moscow with the tome raised high. Don't worry, brothers and sisters, it's all figured out. And I realized, that it was a catastrophe, an abortion, a monstrosity. So I just was, really set back. So then I just shrugged my shoulders and said, oh, okay, I will smoke day and night until I can try and save this thing, if it can be saved. And I did. I did smoke day and night, and I did struggle with this thing. And it was not possible to breathe life into that corpse. This book, I'll just tell you the title in order to convince you that this thing should have died a borning. It was called... I blush to tell you. It was called Crypto Rap, Meta-Electrical Speculations on Culture. Terrible, terrible. So I realized then, at that point, that I was a fool to try to navigate life without cannabis, and that it would just get me in terrific trouble, and that I lost my way and couldn't make judgments and had no discrimination and so forth and so on. Anybody? Yes, sir, you've been struggling mightily to be heard. Next.
I've taken LSD over 1,000 times, and I've taken psychedelic plants a couple hundred times. And I agree that plants are superior, and I prefer them over LSD. However, real, true LSD, such as orange sunshine, is a phenomenal mystery in my experience, compared to the rinky-dink acid that's going around these days. But to the guy who was talking about LSD, I wanted to say that LSD is not confusing. It's the environment and the accumulative unconscious mind, the things that your unconscious mind has collected, that is confusing. It's the environment and society and what they program into your computer that is confusing, not good, true LSD.
But on one level, LSD is confusing, which is that when you buy it, you don't know what you've got. That's truly confusing.
If you buy it from people who don't chant mantras and aren't into a high state of spiritual awareness and vegetarianism, I get it from people.
And I know weasels who chant mantras every day.
And they have to know chemistry.
I know where I get it. I know where I get it from.
But see, that's too much to ask of most people. I recall a conversation I had once with a psychotherapist about MDMA, and he said, it doesn't matter that it's toxic at twice the ordinary dose, because I would never give somebody twice the ordinary dose. I said, but X, you don't understand. People pop this stuff like pretzels down on Sunset Strip. So you have to think of the fool. The fool is always with us. And, No.
I've eaten a whole sheet of 100 doses of LSD.
Well, maybe the fool is not always with us with an attitude like that. No, but it is, the thing about LSD that's confusing is the difficulty to tell what you've got until you're out in it. Shishi, what was your point? Ba 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 ba.
Being that you're both in many ways a master of words, I want to go back and pick up on this fine line that you admittedly are walking in describing the plants as an ally and at the same time describing them as a tool and continually talking about use. And I find also in the questions using the word take a lot, which is our common language around this. And people have asked some questions about the ritual. And also Ralph, I was glad to hear, brought up intention. And I'm curious, knowing that in the Native American traditions there are very simple teachings that respect the exchange when you interact with a plant, whether you pick a piece of sage, you give a giveaway at that point, whether it be some saliva, whether it be something that you offer, that in the traditions that you have been working with, if either within the intention or within the rituals there are these kinds of giveaways and exchanges, and you might comment some more on those so that they can sort of fill our body in this way. Or you might share also some of your own if you carry that deep sense of ally.
Over to you, sir.
Well, I think what a person who has a relationship with an ally plant gets out of it is an enriched and balanced inner life. What the plant gets out of it is a human being with an enriched and balanced inner life. And that feeds back then into stewardship, an inspiration for caring. We then notice that we have this partner, and agriculture was the first great example of human-plant symbiosis, and it was very important to the plants involved. They went from being rare grassland endemics to being great monocultural crops. And orthodox biologists say that successful reproductive strategy signifies successful evolution. So you can say what people got out of taking mushrooms in ancient Africa was increased visual acuity, better sex, and ultimately a rich inner life of cognition. But what the mushroom got out of it was cultivation, and by being associated with cattle, becoming like an episome on the main genetic heritage of human beings. Because when we finally do go to Aldebaran and Procyon, we will take cattle with us, and presumably we will take beans and peas and hemp and spinach. They are the cloud of genes that have managed to insinuate themselves into a relationship with human beings, so that our fate is their fate. And if the sun gutters out and is left behind by us as we radiate out through the galaxy, we will take with us dogs, cats, goldfish, runner beans, morning glories, ayahuasca, but not everything.
And is that your finding, both of you, in terms of that being the ideal or that being the sense that you personally carry? Is that your finding in the people that you work with, this birth of feeling of stewardship?
Yes, I think so. That you can't take these things without facing the facts of the historical crisis, our legacy, our bad behavior, so forth. And that when you face that, then you have to have recourse to some kind of stewardship. I don't know people who are seriously into psychedelics who don't want to change things. I don't know of anybody who says, I take psychedelics and I'm perfectly contented with the world the way it is. Then I wanted to say something else about ritual, and here again I take a controversial position, and it never would have occurred to me to take this position except that the mushroom told me this. This is straight from the shoulder. Said, ritual is a substitute for understanding. It's exact words. And I said, I don't get it. Said, if you understand, you have no need of ritual. Ritual is like a mnemonic device for touching something deeper, which is in danger of being lost. So I recall a situation where I was in the Amazon and we were collecting ayahuasca plants, myself and a young botanist who was Peruvian but very westernized. And we chopped through the ayahuasca bush, and we hadn't talked for a long time. And then as we were chopping it up and putting it into the bags to carry it out of the forest, he said to me, "Don't you think that we should have done a ritual and blown tobacco smoke over it and asked the plant permission to cut it?" None of which we had done. But as we had cut the plant, this had all been going through my mind, and I felt that the moment was so intense that ritual would have been a trivializing of it. And so then I realized that what ritual is for is to ignite attention. That's all. And you must have attention. And Ralph was very good to bring up intentionality, which is a state of attention to what you're doing. And when you incinerate a bud of cannabis or cut an ayahuasca plant or gather mushrooms, it's not necessary to perform a ritual, but it's an abomination to have an empty head at that moment. I mean, you must feel what you're doing. You must be aware that a gift is coming to you, that a life is being sacrificed so that you can deepen your experience. So I don't know if this goes to your question. Ultimately, the give-take question, I think, can be dissolved in that it really is an in-out question. What do I take? What do I give? The planet is a gene swarm, and there is only one destiny for life on this planet. It is the destiny of all of it. And when we take these plants, we are synergized to higher states of intellectual activity. This creates redistributions in the patterns of propagation and growth of the plants. We are inside some kind of huge natural control mechanism. We cannot fail to be in Tao, but we can fail to recognize that we're in Tao. And so it's always a task of bringing back attention and reclaiming a feeling of authenticity in the moment.
Getting back to the taking of such substances, Dr. Israel Regardie, who is the last in the original lineage of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn out of England.
Boy, I'll bet there's somebody who will contest that, but go ahead.
He was the last living English.
He was in that lineage anyway.
Of that lineage. And he had made the statement that he would not accept a probationer into, or a neophyte for initiation until they had undergone 100 hours of psychotherapy, because he had seen how imbalanced people could become through the work of high magic. Do you think that applies to the use of psychedelics?
Do I think psychotherapy should be a precondition to the use of psychedelics? Is that the question? God, let's hope so. I mean, I hope that's the question.
That's the question, veiled by which veils. Do you think that people who do not have knowledge of how the psyche operates, have not really investigated their own psyches, should then take psychedelics, take large doses?
Well, I don't know. Certainly, I don't think psychotherapy is a precondition to taking psychedelics. I mean, psychotherapy is, probably the kindest thing you can say about it is that it's a scam. Certainly, a person should be sophisticated about the dynamics of psyche. And I would, if Ralph's prescription to have clear intention is followed, I don't think a person would arrive at the brink of a psychedelic experience.
If he needed psychotherapy instead.
If they didn't have a healthy interest in the dynamics of the psyche. Most psychotherapy, as it's currently practiced, is, I think, just, as I said at the Albert Hoffman thing, psychotherapy without psychedelics is pissing into the wind and has done a lot more harm than good. What is clear about psychotherapy is that its efficacy depends entirely on the psychotherapist. Freudians, Jungians, Reichians, and what have you-ites all get the same results, which are 1/3 get better, 1/3 get worse, 1/3 stay the same. So clearly method is useless in psychotherapy. It's something about a bonding between two people to sensibly discuss hang-ups. What I think is generally felt to be true among psychedelic researchers is that early psychedelic trips tend to have a personalistic cast to them, tend to address one's hang-ups, problems in relationships, difficulty in coming to terms with parents and loved ones and so forth. But that people who persist with psychedelic experimentation quickly burn through that. One of the objections that I always sort of had to LSD was that I call it abrasively psychoanalytic. This seems to be a compound that only wants to talk about what are basically therapy issues. It wasn't like that for everybody, I gather, but it was certainly like that a lot for me. I mean, I stuck with psychedelics basically because I was so puzzled by what other people were saying about it. And this is where the real skinny is held. I don't think you can read a better book on the psychedelic experience than Mysterium Conjunctiones. And it doesn't mention psychedelics per se, but it deals with the motifs of transformation. And no, I think that if there's a relationship between psychotherapy and psychedelic shamanism, it's that psychotherapists must apprentice themselves to psychedelic shamans and must learn what they're doing, because they're doing better than 1/3 get better, 1/3 get worse, 1/3 stay the same. Neurosis in extremely shamanically oriented societies with a tradition of psychedelics is almost unknown. And I saw these people work in the Amazon, and their intuition and their perspicacity in dealing with human situations was clairvoyant, you know. I mean, they just could go right into it. And so I think the relationship between psychotherapy and psychedelic shamanism should run the other way. To my mind, and I've made this metaphor many times, but it gives the right feeling to it, psychedelics are to the study of consciousness what the telescope in the 16th century was to the science of astronomy. And, you know, the telescope was suppressed. I mean, Galileo had to humble himself. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake. Now they want to suppress the inner telescope, the telescope that brings the stars and galaxies constellated in the human psyche up for close inspection. Well, I suspect they shall have the same fate as they had with the suppression of the telescope. They will just be looked at as pedestrian, plebeian Philistines, and the people who had the good sense to advocate this, people like Ralph Metzner, will be hailed as forward-looking visionaries. I remember once in the Amazon, a very bizarre incident. I was lying with a fever in a hut, and some horrible thing had happened to me. Anyway, I was in a terrible state, and I heard these children singing outside in Spanish. And the song that they were singing, as I slowly and painfully translated it, I could hardly believe my ears. The song was, "Behold, behold, the final illusion. At last, the final illusion." And this is, I think, from the point of view of historical society, what we are looking at. We are looking at the final illusion. The body of Eros, expelled from Greece, burned at Eleusis, driven out of the European mind by busy and pesky celibates, denied, repressed, cut apart, lay in wait in the mountains of the New World for the European civilization that would eventually conquer the New World. And as it burned and pillaged and raped its way deeper into the interior of the new continents that it proposed to put under European sway, at last, in 1953, Gordon Wasson glimpsed the final illusion. It lay like the body of Osiris, like the body of Eros, lost since the fall of paganism, but waiting there to spread back through this proud, vain, scientific, paternalistic, male-dominated society, and to lay the seeds of its undoing, to lay the seeds of an archaic revival, of a return to the way we lived when the glaciers were melting and the game was plentiful, the way we lived when there was partnership and goddess worship and ecstasy and a sense of community and globalism. And this is what we have found. You remember I said yesterday that the archetype of Western society is the prodigal son, the wanderer who leaves his birthright, who leaves the comfort of the village and the bride who was planned for him, and goes out and does something tremendous and ambiguous and unimaginable, and returns with the gift, difficult to obtain, returns with the healing plant, the magic word, the jeweled crown, and lays it at the feet of the mother so long parted from, and by that act creates a historical closure. You'll recall at the beginning of this weekend I talked about the hexagram that had been thrown for the fate of our planet. Work on what has been spoiled. Through the line, work on what has been spoiled by the Father. And what has been spoiled by the Father is the feminine and the planet as the exterior manifestation of the feminine, leading to the change, which is the cauldron, the alchemical vessel, the theater and laboratory of the witch's magic, the potion that transforms. And in the act of transforming nature through cooking, in the act of transforming human nature through the cooking of the historical process, we have made ourselves unrecognizable to our ancestors, even as we shall be unrecognizable to our children. But, ladies and gentlemen, this souffle is done. This pie is cooked. It's time to take it out of the oven, give the oven a rest, and spread the board. You know, with the passing of the patriarchy, I recall that wonderful line in Finnegan's Wake where Joyce says, "Grandpappus has fallen down, but Grinny spreads the board, sunny side up with care. If you want to be parked, if you want to be phoenixed, come and be parked. Because up Nayent, prospector, you're going to sprout all your worth and woof your wings." And so that's what I invite you to do. To woof your wings.
Woof your wings.
Woof, woof!